For folks who don't know me, I'm Hillary Hayden. I am the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. We are a national organization working to stop the harm caused by corporate-centered trade deals and advance a positive vision for international trade that puts workers, communities, and the environment first. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls take place on the third Thursday of every month at 3 p.m. Eastern. They cover a wide range of trade policy topics and are designed to provide education and organizing resources for activists from across the country. Um, I do want to note that these calls are not intended to serve as press briefings. So if you're a member of the media, I would be more than happy to talk with you separately, but this is not the place for any press questions. So just by way of an agenda for today's call, I'm going to start with some framing, including some updates on the Trump administration's pursuit of critical minerals deals. And then I'm going to pass it off to Maria Ramos and Andrew Bogran to talk a bit about Oxfam's policy brief, which explores the idea of a social license to operate when it comes to critical minerals mining. We are going to have time for some of your questions before we close out the call with some action steps. So please put those questions in the Q&A feature. We're going to get to as many of those as we can at the end. And I think with that, we are going to jump in. So I want to start this call by recognizing that we have not had a Trade Justice Power Hour covering critical minerals agreements in quite a while because our organization has been really focused on the US-Mexico-Canada agreement renegotiation process. And I think that folks might be asking, why are we doing this right now? And the answer to that question is that in late February, the Trump administration proposed a massive new plurilateral agreement on trade in critical minerals. And this is by far the biggest critical minerals agreement ever proposed in this country, and likely in the entire world. Critical minerals agreements, you might hear people refer to them as CMAs, like other trade agreements, aren't inherently bad. It makes sense that the United States and other countries would want to secure supply chains of minerals like cobalt, lithium, nickel, and others that are the raw materials used in a range of clean energy technologies, electric vehicles, long storage batteries, solar panels, and more. These minerals are extremely important for the clean energy transition, and they should not be monopolized. And of course, these minerals are also increasingly used in other technologies. The microchips powering AI, as well as military technology. There's a legitimate interest in the supply chains of these minerals, but how governments go about entering into critical minerals agreements and other mining initiatives matters a lot. And insofar as there are going to be agreements on critical minerals, we want countries to meet shared climate, job creation, and sustainable development goals and advance a race to the top for human rights. A critical minerals deal that was beneficial would prioritize things like the creation of good paying jobs in the US and in regions where minerals are being extracted or recovered, the inclusion of strong binding standards for labor rights, for the environment, for indigenous rights and community consent, and all of those things backed by swift and certain enforcement mechanisms that hold companies accountable for meeting those standards. And a real focus on the idea that we can reduce, reuse, and recycle minerals instead of just expanding new mining operations to acquire minerals. This is an idea that folks in this space refer to often as mineral circularity. So these are the recommendations that Trade Justice and 150 organizations across the US and around the world have been calling for and have detailed for the Trump administration, and then also for the Biden administration before it. Unfortunately, this is not going to come as a surprise to a lot of folks here. The way the US is proceeding with critical minerals agreements right now is not prioritizing these kinds of recommendations. Instead, the CMAs that the Trump administration has been signing with countries around the world are accelerating an exploitative model of resource extraction that's harmful for workers, for communities, and for the environment. These CMAs are leveraging the promise of US financial assistance, technical assistance, reduced tariffs, and other benefits in exchange for countries doing a few things. Deregulating their mining and processing operations, promising to export minerals without requiring them to be processed in countries where they're extracted, and in some instances, flat out granting US-based corporations the right of first refusal on mining and processing operations, even ahead of businesses from the country where the mining and processing is taking place. There are no safeguards for labor rights. There are no regulations about pollution, no free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous communities, no promise that the minerals our tax dollars are supporting the extraction of will be used to combat climate change rather than fuel more AI. As is often the case with extraction, the communities on the front lines of these mining and processing operations are taking the brunt of the real damage that these operations cause. And frankly, while there are pretty clear guarantees that well-connected U.S. corporations are going to profit from these agreements, there's no guarantee the U.S. workers or consumers are going to get the benefit. A major reason that these deals that have been completed to date have been so bad is that so far, the agreements have all been negotiated behind closed doors without a lot of meaningful public or congressional oversight. The Plurilateral Agreement that's currently in development, we helped submit some public comments about what that agreement should contain from thousands of Americans. But if the Trump administration gets its way, that's going to be the extent of our public input. We will not get to see what they're actually proposing until the text is written and the deals are signed. And as I said earlier, that plurilateral was formally proposed in February. It's now August, right? 6 months later, we know for a fact that the Trump administration at least has a written draft text for this agreement, but we don't get to read it, right? There are hundreds of corporate lobbyists that have a special cleared advisor status that do reportedly get to read it. And as I understand it, they can pull that text up on their laptops, in their house, or at their office. They can read text. They can get back to negotiators with suggested changes based on what they like and what they don't like. And you and I and the hundreds of advocacy organizations that we partner with don't get to do that unless we change things. We will not be getting to see the text until it's completed. Now, there's one other sort of important piece to this, and that is that members of Congress can read the text. But they, like us, cannot just pull it up on their computers. They have to make an appointment, leave their office, and go to what's called a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, which is a soundproof cage type room where they turn over their cell phones and their handwritten notes, kind of like you see in spy movies. They cannot bring staff with them unless the staff have special security clearances, which most of them do not. And so they're expected to go in and read these dense, very long legal documents without assistance, access to a computer or to experts, and to just analyze and remember what they've read. And even if they manage to do all of those things, they're sworn to secrecy and they are not able to tell anyone about it under penalty of law. It is not a surprise that trade deals created in this way are advancing the interests of the wealthy and of giant corporations, and that these agreements do not have the safeguards needed to create good paying jobs at home or promote sustainable development abroad. The Plurilateral Agreement was at one point said to involve potentially 55 different countries, but I can't even tell you with certainty the list of countries currently involved, timeline or process for negotiations, all that stuff has been classified. This is not how democratic policymaking happens. This is not how we should be making decisions about international agreements that affect things as fundamental as people's basic human rights, the future livability of our planet, etc. No president should be signing backroom deals on critical minerals or on any other topic that help big companies expand their power and their profits while treating working people and communities and the environment as afterthoughts. So, at the end of today's discussion, I'm going to circle back with some suggestions on how you can help make a difference on this issue and how we can hopefully work together to drag this plurilateral agreement on trading critical minerals out of the shadows and introduce some accountability and transparency into that process. But first, we're going to take a deeper look today at why the rules that are written into these agreements matter so much. Specifically, what impact critical minerals mining and processing has on people and communities in the area these minerals are coming from, and what kinds of standards and other policy tools we should be adopting when we think about this issue. For that, I'm very excited to introduce Maria Ramos, who is the co-lead for the Natural Resource Justice Global Program at Oxfam, and Andrew Beaugrand, who is the Senior Policy Lead at the Natural Resource Justice Program at Oxfam. They are here today to share about Oxfam's policy brief on critical mineral security and social license to operate. And I think their report is going to help us shine a light on the very real dangers of moving forward with these agreements without some of these standards, enforcement, and community engagement processes in place. Maria and Andrew, I want to thank both of you so much for being here today. I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about the report. And I just want to give a quick reminder to folks to please put questions that you have for Maria and for Andrew in the Q&A. We're going to get to those toward the end of the call. Thank you so much, Maria and Andrew.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Really lovely to be here. Should we just kick it off, Hillary? Do you have questions for us?
Do you want to share just at the top some of the top line pieces of the report?
Yeah. And maybe just for background. So first of all, stoked to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I see a lot of friends that have joined the call as well. So just shout out to Brian, Serge in Guatemala, and Jimmy, who's calling in from the DRC, from Resource Matters. So lots of experience on the call. So maybe just for background, so Oxfam is a global humanitarian and development organization. We have offices all over the world. We've been working on oil, gas, and mining sector for the last 20 plus years. And we come at these issues from with an inequality lens. So really grounded simply on the right of people to know about project impacts and financial payments, and the right of communities to decide about projects on their lands. And and we're working across some 20 plus countries, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, but in Asia. And 4 years ago, we saw this shift in the market, and we decided really to double down on our work on critical minerals, just given this ballooning global demand and the political opportunity to really learn from the past. I mean, the mining sector, as we know, is incredibly risky for the environment, for the people who live atop the minerals, corruption risks, opacity, patronage. And we wanted to put out a document that really just builds on lessons learned from the past.
That's super helpful context. Andrew, do you have anything to add about the report before I jump in with some of the questions?
Yeah, no, thanks again. Thank you for having us, and it's great to be in a conversation with all of you. Just appreciate the opportunity, and I put the brief in the chat, so do feel free to look at that. I think for additional context, it's also just kind of helpful to get a sense of what we mean by the social license to operate. Or what is meant by that. And I think that, essentially a permit or something to this effect gives you the legal right to mine. I mean, it says the state allows you to go in and pull something out of the ground. The social license to operate is a concept about whether or not you really should be mining there. And a lot of times, you can have the permissions and the permits in place, but you don't really have the acceptance from the local community. And I think that's frankly one of the more critical aspects when we talk about this globally complex supply chain, a very volatile supply chain at times. And we saw that we've seen the threats to the supply chain from COVID and from conflict and elsewhere. This means how do you treat your workers? How are workers considered? How is labor part of your mine? What are the considerations for unions and for labor and worker safety? And also the social license to operate. I think critically what this suggests in our research is that it's something that's ongoing. It's not sort of a rubber stamp, yes or no. It's something that's constant, and it's earned over time, and it can also be lost. And I think what we've seen at Oxfam is that deals that are rushed. You mentioned the lack of transparency when there's secrecy. That social license to operate breaks down very, very quickly. And so our findings are basically that there is there's of course a human rights interest in having a strong social license to operate from companies and from government. But there's also a very compelling business case for this, which is that mines that invest in this, that spend a little bit more upfront to do things right, to make sure that they have that they have a strong engagement team, that they respect free, prior, and informed consent, that they expect community rights. All of these things in place lead to stronger outcomes. And there's a number of responsible mining companies that will parrot these points exactly because they're very much documented and the research is very clear. The last thing I'll say just to open things up is when these when things break down, it can be really costly, and there's a high cost to social conflict. So an example of this is a mine, and I have a specific example from Mozambique, where a mine refused to pay about $1.5 million to a community that needed new roads. They had a couple things that were interrupted by the mining operation. It erupted into a protest, and that mine was shut down. It cost the mining company, I think, upwards of $30 million over a year, just to keep the mine basically unprofitable, unproductive, but sitting empty. And it's the classic case of stepping over a dollar to pick up a penny, and we've seen that consistently across the globe. And I'll go back to this is a sector, to your opening point, Hillary. This is a sector that is notoriously opaque. It does work in the shadows, and so you have an administration that's operating with a similar kind of MO. And I think that combination, it is very dangerous. And when we don't know the terms of trade, the terms of the agreement, how communities are being treated, how workers are being treated, we get really dangerous results, and that are bad for human rights, bad for business too. So yeah, happy to jump in, and thanks again for the time.
Thank you both for that context around the report and also around Oxfam's work. I think I guess what I'll share as context for this conversation is just that when I came back from maternity leave, I was looking through some of the public comments that various organizations had submitted for the Plurilateral, and I think that's where I maybe first interacted with and found this report. And I just remember looking at it and saying, I know that at some point when we're ready to have a conversation about the Plurilateral, we're going to have to dig in on this and on some of the other reports that got submitted in that space. So I do have a few kind of big, broad idea questions, but I wanted to start just by asking you to dig in on a couple of the ideas that are really close to the heart of this report. And I think a good place to start is that the report has this chart, right, that has the various counts of different things that have impacted um, some of the mining and other projects. Um, and it identifies attacks against human rights defenders as one of the most frequently documented local community impacts. Can you talk to us a little bit? What does that what does that look like on the ground? What should governments be doing to protect people who are speaking out about some of these things?
Andrew, I'm going to give that one to you because Hillary, Andrew's working on a report right now that should be out before the end of the year on this.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, happy to chat on this. It is definitely a subject close to all of our hearts, but one that I've worked on at Oxfam, and have been lucky to work with human rights activists across the globe, and in the U.S. Human rights defenders often they're all folks from all walks of life. So everyone from pastors to um, you know folks that have maybe been in a community leadership role, even if it's non official, to entire communities that qualify as defenders. So we're talking about a lot of people. Often they're in a capacity where they're in between a community and a large project. So they're getting pressure from all different angles, and they are uniquely targeted. The mining sector remains the most dangerous sector to engage as a human rights activist. Labor activists count as well, and are heavily targeted. Um, the threats vary. The research suggests that often there's a close proximity to organized crime, particularly in parts of Latin America and the wider Americas, as well as threats from paramilitary groups that are associated with the mine, public security. These threats can be very dangerous, and hundreds of environmental defenders every year lose their life, and many of them are around or engaging mining companies. Um, we talk a lot about in the kind of business and human rights movement, we talk a lot about this concept of a shared space under pressure. And this is a concept that, both businesses and nonprofits, civil society, labor movements share and occupy and work in a similar place. And if there's crackdowns on business, that's often really bad for, civil society groups like ours, and vice versa. When you have a crackdown on civil society, businesses can be harmed, sometimes directly, sometimes it's indirectly, but there is that shared space, and governments have an obligation to protect it, to keep civic space open. Again, you'll kind of hear this theme: it's also good for business. Now, there are limits to how far business and civil society can collaborate, there's going to be tension. But in broad terms, there is this space that's under attack, and it's bad for advancing human rights, for protecting. It's difficult to protect communities in this kind of context, and of course, it's bad for the mining companies themselves. They don't want to have to deal with rampant security forces in their operations. They don't want to have to deal with random tax checks that are unfair or politically motivated. These are all linked, and so and extreme cases, companies that are working in conflict zones have just so many threats that their operations are exposed to, and that they might be exposing defenders and activists to as well. So that's kind of our big focus is really on how to open that space to keep it open for business. How can business champion these issues and keep it safe for folks like us to work?
Interesting. I'll be anxious to hear more about the report that's coming later this year. One other piece that I thought was really interesting in the report, and Maria and I had a chance to connect with briefly ahead of this presentation, is that there are also some interesting gender justice conversations I think worth having here. That women can be impacted by mining projects in potentially different ways, and that their perspectives can be overlooked. I know there are some good examples in the report, but in your view, what do meaningful consultation and participation really look like when these decisions are being made about projects in specific communities?
Yeah, and all over the world, I mean, women are disproportionately impacted by the extractive sector. This is because of cultural norms. This is because of power asymmetries. This is because in many parts of the world, the way that land is held. So land in many jurisdictions is traditionally held by men. And so when a company will come in or government will come in and, consult, if they are consulted at all about land acquisition processes, it's often the men in the room who are consulted and not women. If there is compensation, so payment for land acquisition, this often goes to men who have a leadership role in the household. Uh, there are issues around influx of workers and the sorts of pressures. When you start a mining project, there's an influx of workers. And so the sorts of pressures that puts on a community in terms of services, public services, health services. And also we've seen just an increase of gender-based violence, changes in the dynamics of the family, STIs that have increased as well, HIV/AIDS that have increased, and not enough attention to this before the project begins throughout the project cycle. I mean, mining projects can last 10, 20, 30 years. Not enough attention and not enough resources on this. So this has been a priority of ours as a feminist organization, a priority of ours to raise these issues with government and with companies as well, to consult women and gender minorities at the start and throughout the project cycle, and to ensure that they meaningfully participate in decision making. On a practical level, this might mean that you gather people during certain times of the day, or maybe not when it's farming season, or you ensure that there's childcare, and you provide resources and facilitate it. Maybe this means that you're consulting the men and the women separately because they'll feel more comfortable. And then the other aspect of this is just around decision making around the use of revenues as well. So in many jurisdictions, there will be direct payments from extractive projects where a project is moving forward and when there's consent for it. Anyway, payments that go directly to communities, and often women are excluded from decisions around how to use those funds. And so we've also been pushing on, and at the local level, this is where the relationship between citizens and the state is the closest. So we've been pushing as well just to ensure that there's space for women to participate in decisions around the use of these as well.
That's really, really helpful additional context. Um, so this report felt really timely to me because there's so much conversation right now happening around critical minerals. I feel like I can't open the news without seeing something about critical minerals. Um, People are talking about what they mean not just for the clean energy transition, but for labor rights, for communities, and then in some circles, or things like national security, right? And I want to turn to that question a little bit now. Across the political spectrum, it seems like I said that everybody's talking about the race for these minerals, and depending on who you ask, it's either essential for building a clean energy future, and we need these minerals for green energy, and electric vehicles, or it's necessary for strengthening military and economic competitiveness. Um, I think that your report challenges some of the assumptions behind those conversations. And I guess a question I had for you is from your perspective and drawing on some of the research in this report, what do you think that policymakers, the media, and the public are getting wrong about this current conversation on critical minerals?
Um, I I've been working on these issues for, I don't know, a number of years, 20 plus years. And you're absolutely right. There is a buzz on this right now. Um, it is bonkers to me. I mean, I've never seen this level of activity. So it was a priority under the Biden administration. It's certainly a priority under the Trump administration. But I've never, yeah, we're very much in a commodity boom at the moment. And maybe just to step back a little bit, as you said, it's very much driven, and your intro is very much driven by the geopolitical contestations about control and security of supply chains. China is ahead of the West, right? And so there's concern that China will, turn the tap on or off. And just to add to the flurry of activity beyond the Plurilateral Agreement, which thank you for sharing that. So just in the last year, there have been 21 bilateral agreements or MOUs with countries. So you mentioned I mean, you indirectly mentioned the agreement with DRC, which is like minerals for security. So that was signed, late last year. There was and the same for Ukraine. There was an agreement with Zambia that was floating the idea of like minerals for public health, and there was like a big uproar in Zambia as well. There's forged this new multilateral partnership with some 55 countries. This takes the place of the Mineral Security Partnership. There's Project Vault, which is this, establishes a mineral stockpile in the US, which is similar to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Millions and millions of committed public financing. And it seems from like every agency in the alphabet. So labor, energy, commerce, the US Export Import Bank, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Development Finance Corporation. Just a few hours ago, DOE announced this, 500 million for financing, and the Department of Defense or War, which I hope we can get into in a minute. And so the demand projections are like bullish. So the World Bank estimates that under a 2-degree scenario, global heating scenario, mineral extraction will need to be like quadruple by 2050. And I'm very glad, Hillary, that you also mentioned circularity, because we're not paying enough attention to reuse, recycling, to designed products to foster mineral recycling. Um, and while recycling can meet some demand, we're still going to need new mining, unfortunately. So and then for us, whether you call it green minerals, energy transition minerals, critical minerals, it's mining. It's mining all the same. And mining comes with just tremendous human rights, environmental corruption risks. And so again, part of this briefing document, which we really put together for a US government audience, that's sort of who our target US policymakers, many of whom are coming into this new. So we've been having just a number of just bilateral conversations with folks on the Hill and other U.S. agencies. A number of folks are coming into this new, and so we really wanted to bring in again lessons from the past about how to get this right. And fundamental to this is you need to meaningfully engage the communities that are living around these mine sites. Otherwise, the very thing that you're trying to do, which is secure mineral supply chains, is going to be at risk.
Yeah, I want to say thank you quickly for mentioning those other agreements. I was still out on leave when the Zambia situation happened, but just for additional context for people on this call, my impression is that the U.S. State Department basically told Zambia, if you do not give us access to your critical minerals, that they will turn off funding and other streams for HIV medication. It was nuts. It was nuts. And there was, I think, a lot of backlash in the nonprofit spaces. I'm very sure that the letter of some kind went in about it from us, and it got a sort of strong response from folks at the State Department. But that's the sort of uh, really difficult and horrific back and forth that we're seeing over some of these minerals supply chains. Um, I guess a question that I have is, do you, in your opinion, are there ways that we can ensure that the critical minerals that we are um, investing in the extraction of are actually prioritized for the clean energy transition versus other uses? Is there any way we can do that?
November 7th, 2028. Um, yeah, I think your question maybe is like, how do we incentivize more clean energy in this country? And, and we had that, I think, with that. I mean, that was the ambition of the Inflation Reduction Act. So it provided, investment and tax credits for renewable energy and other consumer rebates for solar, for heat pumps, et cetera. And some of these credits were and incentives have either expired or phased out because of the big beautiful bill. um, so I mean, so there's that, right? So we need to incentivize clean energy in this country, and that will be with sort of political pressure. But maybe some additional points on this. One is that mineral, as Andrew shared, mineral supply chains are incredibly complex, and traceability. So basically, the ability of, say, a renewable energy company, an electric vehicle, automaker, to trace all of the materials in their products to like back to the mine site, back to the source, is super difficult. And Andrew, I'm gonna let you speak to that. The other is that a big buyer of minerals right now is the Department of Defense, or the Department of War. So they have this massive copper, and they are actively investing in mines. So Pentagon contracts, grants. Manga Bay, so the environmental news network Manga Bay recently did an investigation. So they looked at usaspending.gov, the database, and they found some like 27 grants had been awarded by DOW. What are we calling that? DOD. Mostly to US for US projects, some on indigenous lands. They found that some like $500 million had been invested in like the last 4 years or so. $500 million, it's actually not a lot of money, like, because it's just the tip of the iceberg. The challenge, of course, is that the actual amount is likely significantly larger, but under the national security cover, and not and super opaque. And then the other is that the mining law in this country is from 1872, which is like, it's insane. So the U.S. General Mining Laws from 1872. It doesn't require mining companies to pay federal royalties for hard rock minerals taken from public land. So U.S. mining companies pay like a standard federal and state corporate income tax, payroll, property taxes, other taxes, but like the big money, the big payment, the royalties, they don't pay those. I think that's like food for like another one of these power hours, is getting into U.S. mining law, which is insane. But yeah, but maybe Andrew, if you want to say something on traceability, which is such a huge issue at the moment right now in this sector.
Yeah, I think to your point, Hillary, too. I mean, trying to figure out where these minerals end up. And just to be clear for folks on the call, I'm not sure how much familiarity with when we talk about critical minerals. I mean, there's a million names for them. Also, I've spoken to folks in the mining sector who jokingly say critical minerals are like a new term to them as well. Like they don't necessarily, this is kind of a new concept for many in the past 10 or 15 years. Like they saw themselves as cobalt miners or copper miners or what have you. But we talk about critical minerals. We're really talking about these, copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, things that are really essential to clean energy, but also, of course, to AI data centers and to defense technology. And it is very difficult to say what is going where and how it's being used. In the past year or so, we've been looking at a project to examine copper that is coming out of it's called the African Copper Belt, which is southern Democratic Republic of Congo and in northern Zambia. And it's a huge source of global copper. And basically figuring out how it moves through the supply chain, who's using it and for what reasons. And just to give you a little flavor of how complicated this is, I mean, copper that's taken out of the ground will often go to a smelter in the country. So it's, copper ore is like only a good copper is like 3 to 5% copper. So a lot of rock and wasted ore goes out. It's smelted, it's put onto a truck, it's then shipped through multiple locations on the continent. So sometimes on Tanzania, on the east coast of Africa, sometimes through Namibia on the west, or South Africa. Um, from there, it goes to 8 to 12 different countries around the globe for processing. Most of the copper goes to China, but not all of it by any means. And then in China, it might pass to 4 or 5 different factories, and then it's turned into something like copper wire, which you'd see in an EV. That copper wire goes to a battery manufacturer in, say, South Korea. Then it's then sold on to an EV manufacturer somewhere, say in the United States, where it's put into a car. So you can see the number of steps, the number of handoffs, and behind the scenes, you have very massive conglomerate that are involved as well, that are not necessarily in the mining or processing, but for example, shipping companies. Shipping companies are extremely powerful. They act as a cartel, very exposed to corruption risks and everything in between. And then, of course, commodity traders. These are the folks that are basically buying and selling these goods all over the globe. They're based in places like Geneva or London or Chicago. They don't really physically touch the material, of course, but they're sending things everywhere and in control of the financial purse string. So you have this increasingly complex web. So trying to say, where is this copper coming from? Where is this cobalt coming from? Is incredibly difficult. And companies, even the ones that want to make an honest effort, are struggling. So we need more investment in, and going back to this point on transparency, we have to be invested in this. The mining industry is getting away with murder because they are expanding into sectors. I think gold expansion, which obviously isn't really relevant for the energy transition. There's a nominal amount of gold in our phones and things like this, but it's not, of course, essential to energy. But gold has been one of the largest expanding mineral sectors in the past decade. So under the cover of kind of resourcing tomorrow and building a clean energy future, the mining industry is just, it's same old, same old. And to Maria's point, mining is mining regardless of what we call the mineral, and it comes with huge costs and regardless of the end purpose of the mineral. So we have to keep that in mind. And I would just say that, yeah, I think this boom is driven also by defense and AI, and we just need to be very honest about that and figure out a way to sort where it's going. But it does go to the old adage of follow the money. It's as true as it ever was, and trying to figure out who's paying for what and from where is kind of the essential role I think that civil society has to play right now.
There's so many pieces of those comments that I would like to jump in on. Um, I I remember when I was first kind of starting to put my feet in the ground on critical minerals related work, and got the sense that like the minerals that are considered critical minerals like can change over time depending on what's available and that kind of thing. The the one question, we don't do a lot as an organization on like corporate social responsibility sort of work, but I think that some of the comments that you're making hint at the fact that maybe some companies are trying to do a better job at figuring out what's going on in their supply chains. What sorts of tools are available if people want that information, or is it simply that that information is not not obtainable?
I think it's I mean, depending on how you would define corporate social responsibility, I mean, I think that a lot of corporates are interested in the kind of shiny, glossy brochure picture of a health center that they built, which is unrelated perhaps to their operation. Or so there's a certain level of divorce that happens with these CSR initiatives. Um, Now, sometimes they take CSR to be more expansive, to include, for example, traceability, and understanding their supply chain and so forth. Obviously, that's essential. I do think there are some companies that are trying to invest more in it. Many, I think the challenge with the mining sector is that miners care about getting their product off of their trucks and their trains and the ships as soon as possible. And so they're interested in just selling it and moving on. It's a business to business operation. And that's why it's so tough to hold them accountable, because they don't have a big brand. And so, or a public brand, I should say. So that's one of the huge challenges. It's really, I mean, I think where we've seen leadership has been from the purchasers. So like automakers, for example, not only do they have a brand, but they're also at the end of the line, literally. And so they're kind of responsible for where this stuff is coming from. They have an incentive to make sure that it's sourced ethically and sourced in a way that's sustainable, that keeps their own supply chains running and their own cars on the road, so to speak. So yeah, I do think we've seen more movement from purchasers, and I think some miners are responding, but there's a long road to go. And as I said, because it's all, the mining sector has always worked a little bit more comfortably in the shadows, and it's dealing with commodity traders who are notoriously secretive. Um, that they've stayed away from public scrutiny. They trade in information as much as they trade in minerals, and they want to keep that information private. There are databases that you can buy to understand trade flows. They're proprietary databases. They're very expensive, and so they're really not accessible to the general public. And it's definitely it's an issue that we have to resolve and figure out how to. When we do have the data, figuring out how to use it is a whole other conversation.
Hillary, maybe just one more thing on corporate social responsibility. As Andrew said, often companies will tout this in their annual report. We built the school, this hospital, and these things are important to the communities who are living in that area. But that's not where the big money is. So the big money is in the taxes and the royalties and other payments that companies make that are reported or not reported. And so, the transparency push in this sector, for the last 20 years or so, there's been a movement for greater transparency of the contracts that companies and governments sign, the payments, taxes, bonuses, royalties, whether beneficial owners are disclosed and in the public domain, who's actually benefiting from these contracts, who's actually behind the companies, the payments that governments are making both to subnational governments as well, and often that is where the tension is, of course.
That's super helpful information. So, one thing that when we were kind of putting together our own organizational recommendations around critical minerals that we spent a lot of time thinking about was free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous communities whose lands are being impacted by mining projects. Um, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you see that as either the same as the social license to operate or different. How do these ideas, interact, overlap, or diverge?
Yeah, and I see that Brian put something on the chat as well. Obviously, Serge is, yeah, I'm glad Serge is on this call. Yeah, so look, whether a project impacts Indigenous peoples or not, a mining project developer should consult and respect communities impacted by the mine. So the decision to give or withhold consent for a project, that is just good practice all around. But for Indigenous peoples, free, prior, and informed consent is a human right recognized under international law. So the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, soft law, it safeguards the protection and realization of their collective autonomies, the resilience, the right to self-determination, which is absolutely fundamental. Free, prior, and informed consent is a decision-making process, essentially, that ensures that Indigenous peoples have a say in whether or not a mining project moves forward. So, whether it's yes or, yes with conditions or no to mining, and it shouldn't happen just at the start of a project, but really, again, during the life of a project, which could be, a whole generation. So, 30 plus years or so. There was a recent study from the University of Queensland, and they gathered this large data set of mining projects. So they looked at like 5,000 plus projects and found that an estimated 54% of transition minerals are located, and so projects and reserves are located on or near the lands of Indigenous peoples. So this essentially really poses, a disproportionate risk to customary land rights, to traditional livelihoods, etc. And if you're a developer, like you need to know this, and you need to do your homework about whose lands you're intruding.
Anything to add, Andrew?
No, I mean, it's again, it goes back to this, I think, our opening kind of reflection, which is just the value that a healthy, kind of this ongoing process, and FPIC has to be ongoing as well. It's not something that's just kind of earned in a moment, but it's ongoing, and how quickly it can collapse too. And you know, it, I think that we're going to have to wrestle with this massive expansion of mining that's coming, but we're also going to have to wrestle with um, a legacy of distrust by indigenous groups, and mining companies, have not done themselves any favors, and they have a long way to go. And like, I'm not, I think that this kind of, we've seen some companies lead, we've seen some companies take on responsible approaches, but most are not. Let's just be very clear on that. Most are falling way short of where they should be on their FPIC commitments. We did some research 2 or 3 years ago at Oxfam, and I think found that only maybe two mining companies really had serious FPIC policies that would meet kind of international standards as defined under UN law. So it's a long way to go. It's a long way to get the sector, to move forward. I think there may be other sectors to point to that are lower impact. For example, in agribusiness, also with a really deleterious human rights record. But I think there may be other sectors that mining needs to look to for some solutions, or that we need to look to as campaigners, perhaps. But yeah, just to put a punctuation point on that it is a long way to go, and it's an alarming reality that we're facing.
So, I imagine that Oxfam would like to get access to the proposed text for the Plurilateral Agreement on Trade in Critical Minerals before it's finalized. I also imagine there's other critical minerals agreements that Oxfam would have liked to get a hold of the text for before they were finalized. Why is it important that advocacy groups and the public have a chance and an ability to monitor deals like these throughout the negotiating process, have meaningful opportunities to weigh in, that kind of thing?
I have lots of thoughts, Maria. Do you have? I'm sure you must. You start.
Jump in, my friend.
No, I mean, at a very, as I said, at a very basic level, again, these are sectors that are notoriously lack transparency, to put it mildly. Um, One thing, though, that I think that is often is missed, is that these are complicated issues, and it requires, I think, basically more eyeballs, more expertise, more lived experience to understand not only the risks, but also the opportunities. And the more you close that off to folks, the worse the outcome is. It's not rocket science. But what I've observed, I mean, in particular with engagement with US government, are a lot of folks who understand or have worked on international organizations. They understand how, in general, multilateral agreements might work, or bilateral trade agreements might work, on paper, but they have no experience with mining. For example, the mining, we're not a big mining. We don't have a history of mining. I mean, we have a lot of mining companies, but we don't have the same history that, say, the UK or Canada or Australia have. It just isn't kind of in our ethos. Maybe Trump has made it in our ethos, but we don't have that in our DNA, I think, as Americans, or whatnot. It's not something we talk about all the time. So it's like we got to open this stuff up for that reason alone. I mean, you got to have more people looking at this. I mean, and I think that's the role that an Oxfam can play, that folks on this call can play. But without that information, it's very tough. So yeah, I think there's just kind of this like basic good governance question that you're raising with this. And of course, there's more specifics. I think if one thing has been true about the foreign policy of this administration, is that it's lacked nuance, to put it mildly. And I think that, when there are gaps in foreign policy, and when there are huge blind spots, you don't know what risks you're exposing yourself to. And a lot of these deals, when we've been able to look at what's publicly available, there just isn't much in them. So there's not a lot to sink your teeth into and understand what they mean. So I think it causes more confusion than creating solutions. But I could go on, but Maria, I'll pass it over to you.
The agreement that was signed between the DRC and the US government in December didn't go through parliamentary approval. There are tax exemptions that are given to, and preferential treatment that is given to, American companies. Civil society in the DRC was not consulted, did not weigh in. Similarly, and this created, an uproar. Similarly, in Zambia, we discussed the mineral agreement or the public health agreement that had mineral attached to it. That didn't go through, parliamentary review. There wasn't any public oversight, and we need public oversight. So we need civil society to understand this. We need journalists to be able to review this. We need this in the public domain because there's just so much risk for patronage, for double deal making. I mean, there was a New York Times piece recently on Kazakhstan. So it's mining this, I don't know if you saw this, but anyway, this mining deals in Kazakhstan, which essentially implicates like the Trump family, the Department of Commerce, DSC, and just the risks for patronage and just deal making are incredibly high. I mean, this is like, billions of dollars that are on the line that could be going to development, but they're essentially just lining the pockets of, oligarchs. So
Thank you, Maria
that's
and
my answer.
Andrew. Oh,
Yeah.
um, so this is my last question before I want to turn to some action steps for folks ahead of our the end of our call. But Andrew and Maria, if there was one thing that you could leave folks with, either in regard to your report or the things you're thinking about in regard to the mining work and research and advocacy that you do, what is one thing you would want people to walk away from this call with?
Oh, lots of things, but I think right now, I mean, we, and trade justice, Oxfam, so many organizations are really trying to engage Congress at the moment. And I mean, sending letters to the White House, requesting, answers to questions. And this administration likes to tout certain things, and there are many things that they just do not want to discuss. So I think, I mean, and Congress isn't getting anywhere, right? So this right now is really being pushed by the executive with very little transparency about what is actually going on and just flouting, regulations left and right. So I mean, I think we need to, as a public, just continue putting pressure on Congress, continue raising noise, and continue for investigative journalists, continue doing like the very important work of actually just putting some light into these like shady deals.
We are going to talk about one potential way that people can do that in just a second. Um, Andrew,
Yeah, to build off what Maria said, I mean, I think, and not knowing the exact composition here, I do think that one thing that I've observed is that, you know, there definitely also needs to be, an equal pressure on companies. And I think there's a feeling when civil society puts out a report that it's not, people don't pay attention to it. They do. And companies in particular are very aware of what civil society groups are saying. And I think that gives us we have to be specific in our recommendations, create actionable steps forward. And that could be, stopping a mining project that could include that. Absolutely. But it also needs to include, when mining is in an area where maybe it should proceed or a community wants it to proceed, how is it done in a way that reflects those community interests? I think we're going to see an expansion of mining. And that includes the expansion of existing mines. So, how can civil society groups like ours play a more effective role and encourage companies? These are companies that are working on the very kind of the very front lines of development. They're often in very remote places, right? So there's not a lot of government oversight. There's not a lot of regulation that they're following. So know that our reporting and our analysis actually does have a lot of impact on how companies respond, and we need to continue to remember that because I think it gets lost in the noise of it. And then the second and related point is that as consumers, we actually have, I think, a lot more power than we often recognize. And I often think, like, telling consumers to change their habits is a fool's errand, and that may be true, but what I've learned, I'm doing this large documentary project, engaging a couple automakers and miners and environmental defenders and everyone in between. One thing that I've heard consistently is like, you don't know how much power consumers have. So from an automaker who does EVs, has a large EV segment here in the US, they switched all of their car seats from leather to vegan leather. And that was entirely driven by consumer action. They said, if consumers didn't ask, we would never have shifted. They haven't really asked about what's in the batteries yet. Some people have, but it hasn't been the same drumbeat. They start asking, we consistently get these asks and these questions will change because we want to sell you a car at the end of the day. And so I think recognizing that as consumers, we have more power than we think is one thing that I've learned doing this work. It's not consumers' fault, nor is it necessarily our responsibility. But it is a point of power that we have, and so whether we're in civil society or not, something that we should lean into, and I hope you'll take away from this.
Thank you so much, Maria and Andrew, for joining us to talk about the report and talk about your work. I'm going to turn now to a couple ways that we can start to push back on some of these critical minerals agreements and especially the plurilateral. And I suspect that we're going to have other asks around the plurilateral in the coming months. But the first and most important thing I want to ask folks to do today is to contact your member of Congress. I think that Clayton is going to drop a link in the chat in just a second to a letter writing tool that you can use to reach out to your representative. And I think the immediate demand is really straightforward. Congress needs to exercise some meaningful oversight over these critical minerals agreements broadly and over the new plurilateral agreement on critical minerals. Um, just to provide a little bit of additional context, when President Biden negotiated a critical minerals agreement with Japan behind closed doors, he was criticized by Congress on a bipartisan basis. The highest ranking Democrats on Ways and Means and on Senate Finance said at the time, agreements should be developed transparently and made available to the public for meaningful review well before signing, not after the ink is dry. Members of Congress should be asking the administration to be transparent about what's being negotiated, who's participating, and what commitments the United States is making on behalf of the American people. And Congress should not be asked to rubber stamp these agreements after the fact, right? We need meaningful opportunities for the public and for Congress to give input before the agreements are finalized. So if you haven't already, please click that link. Please reach out to your member of Congress via that Write Your Rep tool and share that widely. It takes just a couple minutes, and it does give members of Congress a clear message that people are paying attention to what's happening behind closed doors. The bigger goal here is not simply to stop one bad agreement, right? But it's to establish a different standard for how we make decisions about critical minerals and international trade. Um, and we want a world where workers and communities and indigenous peoples and the environment have a real voice, where public policy is serving people rather than just creating new opportunities for corporations to build profits. And if enough of us raise a stink about what's happening, I think we can still create the opportunity for more public involvement and oversight on the plurilateral and on other critical minerals agreements. But that opportunity will only exist if the administration and if members of Congress know that people are watching and we're not willing to let these decisions be made behind closed doors. So again, access that Write Your Rep tool, reach out to your member of Congress. The other thing I wanted to raise here quickly, I mentioned earlier that over 150 groups have endorsed the ask that we're making on critical minerals. You can see a list of those endorsing organizations and view a whole bunch of great resources. Watch an award-nominated 12-minute documentary short, all at criticalmineralsjustice.org, which I think that Clayton is also going to drop in the chat. If your organization has not signed on to that platform and you are interested, there's a link there to add your organization to that endorsements list as well. So to recap, critical first step, use that Write Your Rep tool to reach out to your member of Congress and share it with folks in your network. The more of us that speak up and raise a stink about this, the more likely we are to get members of Congress to start asking questions and looking into what's happening with the plurilateral. And then take a look at criticalmineralsjustice.org, add your organization as an endorser if your organization's not already there. I wanted to take one more look and be sure. If I think that the links should all be in the chat. I see someone asking where the links are. I think they should all be in the chat window. But the other thing I will say ahead of closing out this call is that I will be sending out a follow-up email that will have all of these links included as well. So, with that, I want to give one big last thank you to Maria and to Andrew for taking time out of their schedules to join us to talk about their report and their work. We are so appreciative to both of you for sharing your expertise with us. I will be in touch with a follow-up email tomorrow morning that will have a link to this call, the policy brief, the Write Your Rep tool, and the Critical Minerals Justice website. So just be on the lookout for that. Together, I know we can make a difference on this. So just thank you so much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.